seconded by Margie. Further discussion on the minutes of October. I was in favor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I don't know if I can vote. Am I allowed to?
You're allowed to vote. You just created them, but you can still vote. Perfect. Thank you very much. Now Steamboat Landing review and update. Let's go to that one next. I did want to let everybody know that there was a meeting, I forgot the date now, in October of the select board. I just went. That was interesting. There was a Steamboat Landing item on the agenda. It ended up being a rather lengthy discussion. And about Steamboat Landing, they sort of asked for a synopsis of the report that we created, which since we wrote it 6 months ago, caused me to sort of off the cuff try to remember exactly what we had said, which was interesting. But anyway, they are finally now looking at that report and considering the recommendations. It was a lot of back and forth about the long terms, but also even the short term discussion, certain short term recommendations we had in there, which ones to move forward on, which ones not to, etc. So that is a agenda item that we will continue forward at the select board level. However, one of the things that came up in that conversation was the use of Steamboat Landing by commercial passenger vessels, tour boats. I was asked to kind of come back to the committee, and I reread our recommendations in our report, and it was maybe not as direct as.
Can I ask a quick question? When they're using that term, are they referring to everything from cruise ship people coming in to Lively Lady or whatever type of small?
I guess that's up for debate, but I mean, really anything taking passengers, taking for hire, passengers for hire.
From 1 to 50.
I don't see how we can, well, actually, no, I shouldn't.
Well,
say
one
that.
brings tour buses and
One brings tour buses and one brings occasional use. So, like Quicksilver comes in from Islesboro occasionally and things like that. Those are passengers that they're taking, but it's an unscheduled use. And that was.
so I just wanted to know whether when they were talking about it, was it all of the above?
It was really what they have. Periwinkle is one of the tour boats in the harbor that doesn't have a license with the town to operate that vessel. They want to operate from Steamboat Landing, as they have done in the past, using tour buses, bring the boats, people, etc. So they have asked the town to use it, and there's a second vessel called Hesper,
But
which is interested in.
Well, he's now sent a letter to both Audra, the town manager, and me saying he doesn't know where people got this idea. He is not interested in using Steamboat Landing.
Okay, great. It was an article in the newspaper about him coming to Camden. It never said Steamboat Landing. It just said he was coming to Camden. And it was in the Press Herald or something. So,
Which is considered commercial vessels?
well, it's a great question. I think they are commercial vessels. I mean, I think they take passengers. They are inspected vessels, etc. The question would be,
They're not paying passengers.
they're not paying passengers, and it's not.
Well, they are.
That's what they are.
That's
Yeah.
debatable. And but the other thing is those aren't regularly scheduled trips, whereas the other ones are. I think there is a difference there. So anyway, I reread our report, and I see, it's got a copy, which is fantastic. So they wanted a statement from us regarding use of Steamboat Landing, our recommendations for Steamboat Landing by commercial passenger vessels is really what I'm talking about it now. I think we could make the statement that regularly scheduled commercial passenger vessels would be a disclaimer. I wrote a little note to myself last night, so I just want to find that.
I'm not sure that would be the distinction. In other words, does this only cover people who come in Tuesday at 3 o'clock,
Yeah.
as opposed to, I would think, the size. I mean, because literally, when in terms of launches, so Lyman Morris picks me up out of my rowboat on the mooring and leaves me at the end of the float, I wouldn't consider that to be the problem we're talking about.
Right.
So it's indirectly, you are paying for that.
Right,
Yeah.
oh, directly, right from my pocket to the driveway.
So anyway, I came up with a statement and I think we wanna let's talk about this statement. Oh, before I get into that though, you have a member of the public, Bob Tom, hello. Do you wanna, can you just grab a mic, just so that you
What
can,
is he on?
just one of the microphones, just so that we can.
Sit at the table.
Yeah.
Terrific.
We're not knocking anybody to do that.
An appropriate distance.
That's great, Tom, thank you.
Terrific.
Identify yourself.
Tom Babbitt, I live at 10 Cove Road. We are the north butter to the Steamboat Landing parking lot. And have been there as a neighbor to the parking lot for over 20 years. So we've seen a lot.
Excuse me, does that mean you're adjacent to it or across?
Adjacent.
Okay.
Jason. So it's been a pleasant relationship. Definitely, yes, we have the occasional car line. Occasionally I go down there and pick up a contractor bag full of trash. Sometimes people park on the lawn, but it's, it's been there longer than we have, so that's life. But this summer, there was a big change when all of a sudden I heard this huge noise and it was a tour bus 50 feet from my deck on high idle to keep the air conditioning going. And I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, this is a residential neighborhood. And I have a series of pictures that if you want to send these around, you can hear it. You can see it.
Yeah.
It's incredible, residential neighborhood to have that kind of noise and distraction. They also park right across the front of the parking lot. They park like that.
You can show that again and
What's that?
that last. Oh, okay. I
Yeah,
see
right,
that.
right, and they go into the parking lot. Here they are loading passengers sitting in the middle of the road. And the problem is there are no crosswalks, there are no sidewalks. The sight lines are about 50 feet, which at 25 miles an hour is about a second and a half. And it's an accident waiting to happen. And I mean, nobody can get past when they're parked like that. The other problem that I see is that the trying to pick up passengers on a regular schedule on Steamboat Landing on that wharf. These people are geriatric, they're older than I am, which is really saying something. And they're, they've got
And there are
kids.
a lot of them?
There are a lot of them too, yeah. It's a menace. Anyhow, Steamboat Landing in any kind of a swell, that dock is,
The worm.
and I can't imagine that someone's not gonna take a terrible tumble. And and Periwinkle has been very kind if I've been trying to get on a launch or off a launch. But if there's one boat, especially at low tide, trying to launch off a trailer and Periwinkle is sitting there, no one else can get in. And they're often there more than whatever the limit is, 10 minutes. So anyhow, I just think it's really a critical situation, and I think that they, they ought to do their pickups in the town wharf, the day sailor wharf, where it's always calm and there's an approved bus stop. There are crosswalks, there are sidewalks. It's a civilized way to do it.
Great.
Questions?
So you live-
Yes, sir.
For the passengers on these buses, what are they doing?
They are bused from Rockland to take a boat ride in Camden.
It's your observation that they are taking boat rides,
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, all.
not getting off the bus just to look around.
no. No. Sometimes
Are they from the bigger cruise ships in Rockland or,
I believe so,
okay.
but yeah, it seems kind of incongruous to bus people from one harbor to another to take a boat ride.
Margie.
So you're listing of multiple problems in my head.
Right.
Okay. So first of all, the noise level, parking adjacent to your property.
Mhm.
Can you tell us what is the average amount of time that the bus sits there and idles it to keep the air conditioning unit going?
It can be 10 minutes to a half an hour.
And how often? Is it just one at a time or?
Oh, it's hard for me to judge because, I mean, sometimes they come multiple times a day.
Okay,
And also, we sail and we spend as much time on our boat as we can, so we're not always there.
so there's the buses parking there making ruckus. Number two, the buses parking in the road blocking the flow of traffic.
Right,
And number three, tour buses dropping off tourists to go onto the steamboat landing, and you're concerned for the safety of those elderly individuals,
elderly individuals, yeah, that's very.
mature individuals. Okay, so is that the scope? Are those the three things you're bringing up here? Okay.
Yes,
Tom, do you have a solution or recommendations to offer?
well, I think there's two solutions. One is to have Periwinkle pick the passengers up on the day sailor dock. And the second one is Periwinkle goes to Rockland by water, which would be much more fuel efficient, I would think, than driving a bus to pick up the passengers off the cruise ship or off the Rockland town dock.
So I'm gonna just be careful there, just in that our scope is steamboat landing only. And so we want to, with regards to this item, so we want to sort of keep in our lane a little bit there. So as I said, the select board has asked for a recommendation from us regarding steamboat landing, the use of steamboat landing. So basically what yep.
I didn't fully see the picture, but when they're parked in the road, it's really impossible to get, not that one, because
The bus.
you don't need any convincing for me that buses shouldn't be, that lot was never intended for big buses to sit or do anything, maybe other than back in and turn around. But it's really cars and trailers and stuff, but that one, so that they would not be able to park in a way that you can drive around it. Right, period.
Well, they do sometimes park further up the street on the side, but
Yeah.
I don't think a trailer could-
Different places. but-
yeah, I don't think a trailer could get down there on the bus.
In speaking with people that live on the condos on the harbor, whatever that is, they were very upset with them and thought they'd gotten rid of the tour buses, but evidently they only pushed us over.
So, yeah, so I
So
think, yep,
So do we think this is more an issue that the select board should be handling as opposed to us?
us only as it relates to steamboat landing.
Right,
So that's why they want to know from us, what is our recommendation regarding the use of steamboat landing by tour boats? Let's call it that, tour boats. I think we've explained it at some length in our report, and thank you, Tom, in other testimony that we've gotten, that the existing infrastructure there at Steamboat Landing is unsuitable for the loading of tour boat passengers. Let's call it that, T boats, whatever we want to call them. There's problems, as we've seen, with parking. We've seen problems with access, whether it's a tour bus that is on Steamboat Landing Road. I've seen that myself, where they've unloaded right on Steamboat Landing and it puts up brakes on everything that happens on the road, or back in that parking lot, as also, as you've well pointed out, it is totally unsuitable for that. It's not designed for that, and it doesn't work on a variety of levels. And also, as again, we pointed out in our report, the dock itself is it was never designed for
Right.
the loading and unloading of large numbers of passengers, and certainly not what I would perhaps call non-marine passengers. A boater, somebody like Tom, who spends a lot of time on the water, can perhaps navigate the, what do you call it, the worm? You know,
You mean the pre-elderly?
yeah.
The real, yeah.
But I think that conventional tourists, non-boating tourists, that's just an inappropriate situation. And I think the town is exposing itself to great deals of liability. So therefore, I think that we do not recommend that steamboat landing be used for the loading and unloading of tour boat passengers. How does that sound?
I don't know how I did, because I don't think we've really talked about we haven't even talked about this boat, how they come and go. To me, it's tour buses, period.
Well, I think I
And if
was.
there was a van, that'd be something else, but
I was gonna agree with you, but actually, I think that it is bigger than that, because there's the tour buses, that's the elephant that, you know, everybody sort of talks around, it's the tour buses are the biggest problem. But there's also, no matter how they get there, whether they get there by 16 Volkswagens or a tour bus, they still have to go down that dock. And I don't think that that dock is appropriate for.
I would think that that's a matter of operator shot selection. There are plenty of days when it's perfectly safe to walk down there.
Yeah.
There are days when it's not safe for me to walk down there.
But then you're relying on the operator
Yeah.
to make that and exposing the town to the liability of the operator's judgment. As
But you
opposed
can
to-
have just as infirm people, and I've seen getting on and off boats, pleasure boats, or the ride out to Islesboro or whatever. And so to me, that gets into so many other issues about when people should be allowed to use it. And that even the length of the boat is hard, because you can have larger sailboats come in there and they're taking up space too. It's not just the elephant in the room, it is the whole issue really is tour buses down there in an area that isn't made for it.
Bruce,
Steve,
Yes.
could Periwinkle use that town dock that you leave open for people to come in different times during the day? You know, outside the- could you load, could they load from there?
Well, yes, the short answer is yes, but currently, when I started, there was definitely something in the ordinance that said no day sailor can run off the overnight
Oh, okay.
docks. That's why we have a day sailor dock. Now, there is a seventh permit that the select board could say, well, why don't we just give the seventh permit out to that Periwinkle? But for some reason, I think that the select board feels that there's enough. That we discussed,
right, it would require a new agreement.
But there's that part of the finger floats that, like when there's a cruise ship, that the launches come in and unload right there.
Well, definitely the cruise ship used to use that load unload.
Yeah,
But one of the reasons we kind of got rid of the cruise ships is because it was tying that up quite a bit, making it a little congested. And again, you have these elderly people coming off these docks, and we have got new docks since then, which are more stable. But I remember the old dock system, and you're supposed to get off and you're like, and you were so sit there in my office go,
but it's still a lot calmer than steamboat.
Oh, for sure. It's definitely more
Operated
protected than
certainly
steam
much more
landing, yeah.
calm.
I mean, there are multiple issues here. We're relying seemingly on people using their common sense judgment as to whether they can navigate the worm or any other float dock, if there's a little bit of wind or inclement weather. As we know, common sense is not epidemic in this country. So it's tricky.
Well, Elliot,
Regarding liability, at that meeting on October 18th, the select board meeting, Aaron Lincoln made a statement that I believe, to the extent that the commercial passenger vessels insurance indemnifies the town from liability.
that is only My understanding of that, I'm certainly no lawyer, is that that is true for the vessels that are required to have that insurance as part of their commercial passenger vessel agreement with the town. I want to be clear, Periwinkle does not have a commercial passenger vessel agreement with the town of Camden. They
Is
do
it not
not.
a second boat?
It is not, the second boat is only, the term second boat is only as it relates to the selling of tickets. So that Periwinkle has no, correct me if I'm wrong, but Periwinkle has no formal relationship contract with the town of Camden. So,
Okay.
so anyway, to wrap this one up, just, yep,
There are other commercial users of Steamboat Landing.
yep.
Right.
That's why we want to keep this one just to passenger vessels. Commercial passenger.
So,
vessels.
so
The select board asked for that in particular.
But like a water. taxi.
So let's say Randy Gaggy takes a couple out on his lobster boat for a lobster tour on an occasion. Where's that fit into this picture? Does that make him a commercial passenger vessel?
They're paying for
I
tickets.
mean, is he charging? Is he?
Well, yeah, and back to substitute any other name other than the police chief, but.
No.
It has
I
nothing to
mean,
do
I'd
with
like you on that one, Steve.
Well, I think we need to back up for a second here, just to get some clarity. You know, when I first started 21 years ago, it was the first year that the town, the harbor committee, had made these floats, because there was no floats before that. It was just this kind of podunk place to put your boat in. Obviously, a long time ago, it was this grand place with almost like a small hotel on it.
Yeah.
It took steamboats from Boston with lots of passengers. There's pictures of cars up, on that thing. It was intended as a place to launch and retrieve boats. And I don't know if they had any other idea what could happen. And now, since the population has become more here and the use has been, increased, now people look like the Periwinkle are like, this is the only place I can use to pick up people. The comprehensive plan says that we're supposed to be promoting the maritime, marine and related commercial business as much as we can. So it's hard for the committee, because I remember 10 years ago, this committee sat here and was like, almost unanimously, yes, we should allow commercial use at Steamboat Landing. Now, the fact that we have this incident now where, we're kind of, letting it happen. And now we're at this point where we should talk about it, which we are. I think it would be a shame if we, obviously, commercial fishermen, we let them use it. Boats that you mentioned, Mr. Chairperson, how a boat like Quicksilver can take a group of people, because there's a big job over at Owlsboro or Ronald Haven, and they start using it for whatever month, and then they're done. They come early in the morning, construction people, 6 o'clock in the morning, and they've got their little igloos with them for their lunch and their stuff, and they go. I don't see that as a problem. But now, I do see this as an issue. Obviously, we've got Tom here, and he's like, him and his neighbors feel it's an issue. So it's a great thing to talk about. I think it's good, make sure we're clear that if we're talking about commercial passenger or limiting, commercial passenger vessels to use Steamboat Landing, then we have to make sure we're clear on what we're talking about.
Yeah, so perhaps that's the way we should rephrase this and not use the term commercial passenger vessels, but to rather say tour boats. Use of Steamboat Landing by tour boats is inappropriate for the existing infrastructure. I want to make sure that that's clear. This is for the existing infrastructure. That is also part of our.
That's
You think tour boats is
that's
too
getting
loose?
confusing and
I think we should be putting this, having our report come back out and doing this at the next meeting where we've really defined what it is.
Yeah, we actually can't, because they need to, the select board needs this in order to move forward with the application that they have for use. They asked for this, so we have to give them an answer.
Well, my thought, and I guess my suggestion is, we don't need to come up with a legal definition that Bill Kelly can come up with. I think we need to identify what it is that we're saying is a problem. And personally, my feeling, the problem is not so much the boat. Or necessarily even the person who's walking. It's how they're getting there. It's the tour buses. When contractors come and they park on C Street or wherever they park, or they go around the lot and they carry that's not a problem. And I don't care if there's 20 of them getting on the boat at 6 a.m. The problem is Tom's tour buses. And I think if we identify that's the issue that the select board should figure out how to limit or eliminate, then they can do the detailing.
And to a certain extent, that is not really a topic that we should even be talking about. That's a parking problem.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Well, but isn't it, I don't know whether our jurisdiction literally is at the water's edge as opposed to, we've got the parking area that relates to it, the steamboat landing road, whatever it's called, the complex.
We have stayed away from parking at the public landing down here. We've stayed away from that topic historically.
And I would agree with that, but when I talk about Tom's parking lot,
Oh, right.
that is dedicated to this. As
It is.
opposed to public landing where you can park and go anywhere you want in town.
But it's sort of tangentially, it's tangentially connected. I think it is definitely a place where it blurs the line. Technically, I think our jurisdiction ends, at the shoreline connection, as it were. In this case, I think it's sort of.
Could we recommend that the parking committee say no buses down there? Somehow?
Well, there's also,
Well, okay,
in lot
let's,
parking, and then there's, how would they pick up? And
So-
Right,
could
no
they be
loading
way
of-
away and have a radio say, we
So
are
let's-
here now? and drive
let's try to
down."
keep this a little simpler. I think, can we all agree, are we unanimous on that the use of steamboat landing by tour buses is in its current configuration inappropriate? Can we all agree with
Yes.
that? Let's have a vote on that.
At least a problem.
Let's-
yeah,
Yeah, because it's the use of steamboat landing
yeah,
by tour buses. Tour buses are delivering, they are part of the steamboat landing use because they are bringing them there.
It's an interesting concept that as a harbor committee, you're trying to help the select board decide whether or not the infrastructure at the water's edge and what the conditions, if you allow of vessels that need tour buses to actually exist. Now you're saying that, well, by doing that, the infrastructure itself might be able to hold that, but we know that it's gonna cause an issue because of how you're gonna bring people to and from that vessel.
So let's,
okay, how do you want to word it? So I can write it down.
I think we need a motion, actually, and I think I can create it, why not, right? That the harbor committee recommends that the use of that the steamboat landing not be used by vessels accessed by tour buses, how do I say?
Yeah, requiring.
Requiring tour buses that are served by tour
Cannot
buses.
be served or loaded, but
Served, or loaded by tour buses.
So show up with 3 18-passenger vans.
I mean, it's a good question, because
But
distinctly possible.
When they-
and what is a tour bus then?
I've seen the tour buses there and never had a problem. When they were actually having people walking up the dock and they back down near the condos. It didn't bother me because honestly, there are plenty of boats, either, trailers and the launching boats that tie the area up just as long. But it's when they sit there for 20 minutes waiting for the boat to get to the shore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that did, I mean, you haven't had that experience. I know that the condo folks have.
Oh, I'm sure you
And
don't.
I have actually myself almost been run over by a tour bus backing down Steamboat
Really?
Landing Road. Yep.
Well,
And,
luckily, you're
so-
not there when I back my trailer down.
so.
what could be worse?
So it is a problem. So, okay, so do you have a decent motion there?
I said motion, use of steamboat land. Oh, I got the use of steamboat landing not be served or loaded by tour buses, and then I added as presently configured, but I'll probably move that
Yeah.
closer to steamboat landing.
I think we get the gist of it. And they don't, I mean, they don't need a perfectly worded statement from us. All right, further discussion on that one? All those in favor of that statement? 1, 2, 3, 4. Elliot's gonna hold off on that one.
Correct.
All right.
Maybe we
I'll
should have a
second
discussion
it.
first. What's the concern?
Well, I see, the reason I do not favor that is because it's an infrastructure issue, a town infrastructure issue, in my opinion. And secondly, it's discriminating against a specific commercial user.
Are,
Arjun.
are there public parking lots where the tour buses can go and lie and wait for their?
Yes,
A
so
lot-
there-
a lot around.
Well, actually, no. So
Well-
there are, this is where this gets really complicated. There are specific zones for and locations for tour buses in the town of Camden. Where tour buses, there's an actual tour bus ordinance where they
One's
can
across
be.
from Laverdiers, I think.
One's across.
Yeah.
One is,
How long you lived here?
one is across the street from the Village Green, right here, right across the town office, is a tour bus loading and unloading zone.
Elliot, you voting against or you abstain?
School
Again.
parking lot on Milton Street and near the middle school?
Nope, that's not in the ordinance.
Yeah, and the tour bus cannot be from Camden
No.
and use that spot. It's gotta be from out of town.
Like Rockland.
Yep.
Wow.
Can't,
What does that mean?
tour bus cannot be from Camden and use that.
Meaning they have to have taken people from
From
outside of Camden, or
Yeah.
literally can't live here.
Yep, for instance, if you wanted to start a trolley business and your trolley is based in Camden, you can't use that to pick up people and bring them to Rockport. Use that as a stop.
You use one.
Use.
That's that area across from the town hall that we're talking about.
All right, I want to keep this moving because we do have a lot of things and this is not, I think I think the select board will get the gist of our concerns with tour buses. But I do want to just close the loop and I will make a motion that the existing dock system at Steamboat Landing is inappropriate for the loading of passengers onto tour boats. And therefore, we do not recommend the use of it by.
This is separate and
This
distinct.
is a separate, I'm doing a second one. Because I think you're right, Bob, that there are two different issues. There's the tour bus issues, and then there's the dock issue. And I think we do need to
For a loading and unloading of tourists?
loading and unloading of
Passengers.
passengers onto tour boats.
But what's a tour boat?
I'm just gonna state a statement in that, I'm just gonna leave it there. A tour boat.
Say that 10 times quicker.
Subchapter T-boat, I mean, whatever you wanna, you could call it a T-boat, you could call it but I think tour boat is. What I'm learning is if we keep this straightforward, it makes more sense to everybody. Further discussion on that one, on that motion, Bob?
I don't think it's specific enough, and I'm not sure I agree in general, because I'm not sure whether we're talking about the length or the number of people getting off at a given time, or what it is that would be objectionable about it, and I have no idea whether that includes the lobster boat with 2 people, I don't know how big these tour bus boats, how many people, I just don't know what we're talking about, so I really can't say object to it, so I'd be voting against.
Don't you think we could leave that purview to the select board to decide?
That could be dangerous.
Okay,
Well, but it's gonna be interpreted as if however anyone hears that word, they're gonna say, oh, that's what the committee meant. And I'm not sure we know what we mean.
Really?
I think the wording of that statement implies that Steamboat Landing dock is unsafe. And that's a larger issue.
And to be clear, that's a good point, because that's not what we're saying. We're saying it is unsafe for the loading of non-marine traffic or large scale non-marine traffic. I know we're getting into some gray areas, because then you could say, well, the Quicksilver's taking construction guys and they're non-marine traffic.
Landowners.
Yeah.
Landowners.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I know I've ridden the Equinox and they take 20-something people.
Mhm.
Is that a tour boat or is that a work boat?
It depends on who they're loading.
Whether they're carrying igloos or not.
Hey,
Right, right. They're looking very cooler.
I think the big issue is that the complaint that Tom has brought forth is specifically geared toward tour buses.
Right.
And it's particularly oriented towards the fact they're sitting there idle.
Right,
I think we've addressed that one.
And loading passengers in the middle of a road.
Yeah, I think we've gotten that one,
We
but
already have a recommendation in our report that says it's inappropriate for those passengers, that the worm is inappropriate.
we did actually, you're right, we already said that we had concerns about the worm, and that it is, inappropriate.
So maybe they
Maybe that's enough. Okay,
30 pages.
fair enough, let's move on, we're gonna be here all day if we don't,
Yeah.
stick on that one. So,
Could I just have one other question?
Sure.
One of the reasons I'm here is that a neighbor, another abutter to the parking lot, had heard a rumor that there were changes coming to the parking lot. Is there any truth to that?
nothing.
You mean the floodlights?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And the
Not that
carnival,
I don't know anything about.
Yeah,
the casino.
the rate.
I would ask,
The
Tom,
outdoor
I would
rate.
ask the town manager on that one.
I think there was some conversation about sort of organizing it and,
One of our recommendations is that parking lot be improved. And we don't actually go into what that means, because right now it's just pretty overgrown. But in that report that we did, we do say that should be better organized, that parking lot. So that may be what they're
Yeah.
talking about.
As a butters, I can tell you that we are concerned with losing any screening at all.
Right. Well, that's fair. That's definitely fair. Really,
Josh, you mentioned the select board is anxious to receive our recommendation because they have an application pending.
they are, at this meeting that I was at, they were looking for guidance on how to proceed with with Periwinkle in particular, and at the time Hesper, which was another boat that was going to use it. And the town manager looked to the select board and said, I need guidance on how to respond to these people. And so they then said to me, take it back to the committee. And we have your recommendations, but we want a recommendation on this point. Use of steamboat landing by passenger vessels. I said, okay, we'll get to it. I think we have. Thank you. Move on. I am going to adjust the agenda now to respect people's time. And I'm going to take item 5, the moratorium, peer moratorium revision, as the next agenda item. So we'll do the harbor fees as the item after that. I don't think I have a motion to move an agenda item, do I?
no.
All right. Okay, so let's move on to the report. I do apologize for getting it to you guys late in the day. Bruce worked very hard at putting something together. I want to make it very, and then I edited it and sort of tried to make a few more points in it. This is a draft. This is a draft document. But I think you, Bob, last time had said, we need something to sort of sink our teeth into and say, what are we saying, and how can we cite the appropriate ordinance sections in it. So I have tried to do that. I am quite confident that we have not completely succeeded, but hopefully we've made some good progress. I think in terms of how we review this, I guess I want to get, first of all, what guidance do we have? How do we do in terms of the overall structure of this? Do we feel like we identified four aspects, if you will, of four areas of concern? Those were habitat density, habitat, public access, and climate change and sea level rise. Those were the 4. I guess that's my first question. Did we miss anything there? Anybody feel like those were the 4? Okay, good.
It's hard having just gotten this. this
To
morning.
review.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so the goal of this meeting is we are going to go through this and hopefully have some changes that we can put together to create a final document. I'd like to do that in the next meeting. We may not be able to. This is something I don't want to, well, I could say, I do want to push it because I've been asked to keep it moving, because once we're done with this, with our recommendations, then the select board and the planning board get involved and decide whether or not to actually formulate ordinance amendments that then go to the voters in June. The timeline for that is very, very long, so I think it has to be done. I see Jeremy on Zoom, and I think it has to be done. It has to be done by March. Is that correct, Jeremy?
Yeah, for the most part, by the end of March, everything needs to be done and the warrant articles need to be finalized late March, early April.
Okay, so that's like done. We've had public hearings, we've had everything. Okay.
Yeah.
So my goal with this was to get it to the select board in December, so that they could then have basically January and February to hash it out, go through the planning board, because I think they'll get involved, and then take it from there. Does that seem like a reasonable timeline to you?
How do we bring in the other committees, the conservation and?
Oh, yes, I should mention that. So I did meet with Rebecca Jacobs from the Conservation Commission. We had a really nice meeting with her. She is very interested in helping us and basically reviewing what we're doing to see if we've missed anything from her side, from a Conservation Commission side. As I explained to her, and I also talked briefly with Ethan previously, the planning board, is that I wanted us to do our work, and then they can, and then we bring them in, so we don't have too many cooks in the kitchen as we go through this process. So I'm not excluding them. I didn't exclude them from the previous meetings,
Right.
but I wanted to wait until we had this, until we had something for them to then say, oh, okay.
Well, it'll be hard for us to get done by December if after we come up with.
So they were, oh yeah, so lastly, they were both invited and were going to come to this meeting. Unfortunately, they both have had situations where they can't come, they both got ill, so they couldn't come to this meeting. Ethan was on.
Yeah, we got bumped, both of us got bumped out. I had to completely reboot and join back in, Josh.
Well, sorry, well, I'll admit Ethan again. Rebecca wrote to me last night and said that she would not probably be able to come. I'm trying to get Ethan back into the meeting. There he is. Into his audio. Hi, Ethan. Sorry for kicking you out of the room. I guess we lost you there for a little bit. You're muted. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, cool.
And no worries.
All right. Ethan, we were just, all you missed was us saying that we have, we've now created a draft, very much of an initial draft of recommendations. We're going to spend some time today sort of discussing and figuring out what if anything we missed. And then, and sort of concurrently with that, we're reaching out to you on the planning board and Rebecca Jacobs from the Conservation Commission to see if there's things that we ought to be considering. I want to be careful that this is the Harbor Committee report, because I think it will come to you eventually anyway. But I want to be careful that we have your input into it, and that is sort of doesn't come out of left field. So I apologize for getting to you late. As I said, maybe before the meeting started, even it's in putting this together, we have found that it is a little bit of a many-armed beast because we have so many. There are so many aspects involved in the moratorium. The piers, docks, floats, ramps, and other structures, which is of course pretty broad group. And then we have the outer harbor and we have the coastal harbor. So I actually tried to lay it out in like a diagram last night or this weekend rather, and then that just kind of came apart. So we're sticking with this procedure for what we have right now, this draft. All right, well, again, everybody got this last night, so I don't expect anybody to have it memorized. But
I'm still working on the fourth page, third
Still.
line. Just memorizing it.
Oh,
No,
okay, you're almost there. Well, I think I think we just agreed that we're all, we like the methodology, I guess, of calling it, for how we broke this down from density, habitat, public access, and climate change. I'm also trying to be sensitive to, we could make a lot of change, we could suggest a lot of changes if we wanted to anything. And when we do, there are a lot of unintended consequences that, you know, as soon as you start changing an ordinance, there's a lot of pieces that come into play when you do that, other things that are referenced, etc. Not our job to find each and every one of them, but I am sensitive to what we do and what the impact of that might be. So it doesn't mean that we want to do no changes, but it does mean we want to do no harm if possible. All right, well, let's just go through this, and Will Gartley has joined us. Good morning, Will.
Morning.
I just want to let everybody know Will is here. Public know Will is here. I alerted him to this meeting because he has proven useful in the past, so I want him to be aware that we're here. I think methodology, I feel like we're all okay. We talked a little bit about the history of how we got here.
Yeah.
Got reading on my phone.
I wondered if Will had an opportunity to read the draft.
I sent it to him last night. So I don't think so. No, he's going to speed read it. We talked a little bit about the fact that the moratorium has been extended. Jeremy, I will be, when we get to final wording, I will want to talk to you because I understand that, we had the two different start dates, one for the outer harbor, one for the coastal harbor. And then I learned from Sophie Romano that apparently there was something done and those were merged. And now we have just one set of dates as far as I know. So I'm going to look to you to kind of, maybe you can just send me how that came about or whatever, so we can just have it clear.
Yeah, I think that was one of the last select board meetings before they finalized the warrant language, is when that occurred, Josh. Before last June.
Oh, okay, so actually, they merged them into one set of dates before the warrant. Oh, okay. And then there's just a little bit about definitions. We talked about the fixed pier, the float. What a float is, I think is actually important that we all kind of keep that in mind. All right, so then we just broke it down into the various sections, density, and we talked about the outer harbor and the coastal harbor. The outer harbor has a few protections, if you will, that exist about protecting density. One being setback from the property line, as it were, and the other being the separation between existing piers. Those are the existing protections, if you will, for density. In the coastal harbor, we didn't actually find any. This is where I'm looking to everyone to read through the ordinance and let me know if we missed something.
These headings, outer and coastal, don't quite match what's being said.
What?
There's outer harbor, but then you start talking about the outer harbor under the main coastal harbor.
Oh, I wanted to say what the I see what you mean. Just let's not worry too much about like sort of how the blocks
Okay.
are laid out.
Yeah,
We can,
all right.
you and I can just mess with
Okay.
that later.
All right,
I see what you mean though, that below coastal harbor. it's sort
We
of-
have paragraphs.
Yeah, we need a little
Yeah,
break there kind of
yeah.
thing. But in the outer harbor, there essentially aren't any ordinance measures that
You mean
I mean
coastal?
coastal.
coastal, sorry. In the coastal harbor,
Well, there is one. That the float can't be any place where it's over 6 feet deep. It means
On the coastal?
on the coast.
coastal harbor, the pier can't be, it has to go only to deeper, no deeper than 6 feet. Pier.
Right,
So you think,
Right.
so that by its very nature. is
Oh,
what you're
okay, so then
thinking?
okay, maybe it's the pier I was thinking of.
It's the pier can't be, you can't have a pier that, the way I read it was that you can't have a pier that goes out and drops to, 17 feet or something. like
Okay, so
that.
pier, oh, never mind. then
The
that's-
pier itself.
Yeah,
I mean, I suppose one could argue that is a de facto,
in some places it's so deep that you can't put a pier there. It's way more than 6 feet.
Okay.
It's a cliff, and it's 30 feet deep.
So it does say that,
No, it doesn't. It says the pier can't be more than 6 feet deep at mean low tide where.
right, but what you're saying is this current ordinance essentially eliminates it for any of those truly deep water access
Right.
points.
Right,
Because it has, the intent was to draw them in so that you're only going as far as you need to go to find water.
correct.
But that's also meaning that a lot of people couldn't have a 20-foot pier going to a float because it's dropped off to 20 feet of water depth already.
right,
Right.
right up there.
And that's in the coastal harbor, not in the inner harbor. I mean, not in the outer harbor. But
Well,
that's,
I think we probably.
it's a limit, it's a limit.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we sort of missed that because you're thinking about how to limit as opposed to, really? We want to have a accidental prohibition for deep water docks? And I think you would fix that in the outer harbor by saying you have a,
Well, in that case, you just put a ramp and a float, you wouldn't even.
Right.
but it can't exceed X feet in length unless it's needed to get to 6 feet of water.
And that's what, and that, it is actually, there's two parts to it in the coastal harbor where it says it can only be, I don't know if it's, well, I have it right there.
The length of the pier shall not exceed the shorter distance of the following: 150 feet as measured from the harbor line or to a point where the depth of water at the end of the pier at mean low water does not exceed 6 feet.
Okay.
So in the case where it drops instantly to 7 feet, you can't have a pier, you can't have a pier at all.
Right.
Because it's the shorter distance,
It's shorter.
the shorter of the two.
Okay.
But you can have
So
a
it's
ramp
really
and
sort of
float
reversed.
without a pier.
It is.
It should be the longer of the two.
Right, in the outer harbor where it talks about your pier can be 150 or 100 feet, or to mean low water, whichever is the greatest.
The greater, here's, whichever's the least.
This one, it switches it, I think.
I guess that is a
I think we need to address that.
de facto,
Because I could be wrong. It just sounds to me like someone screwed up the language.
Well, you could put a ramp and a float, not a
I
pier.
think the intent there, and I remember talking, I mean, I've been coming to this committee for over 20 years. I remember having this discussion many times, and it was to try to limit it to being any longer than it needed to be. And I think when they did it, it seemed like it made total sense, but it is a little
But I
tough.
wouldn't think that if you have a float, a ramp that's sort of attached to a cliff, going down to a float, and then you've got sea and backwash, that's not really safe.
No, it's not. And what can happen is like you said, if you've got deep water, you don't need a pier, right? You just put a gangway and float. But if it goes out gradually, you can't get enough, you're not gonna have a gangway that's more than 50, 60 feet, they get heavy,
Right.
right? So if that doesn't get you past
Right.
a spot, like the first spot that you can put, I don't know, it can be tricky.
Mhm.
I'm not sure I haven't seen this as been a big problem yet. But there aren't many piers in the coastal harbor.
Right.
Nobody's tried to because.
Can you apply to the select board for a variance or an override or something?
Why don't we just make a note to, since we haven't even talked about or looked at this, if we can make a note
yeah,
that in December we'll come back and figure out whether
It's kind of independent from the water.
it's just plain,
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's a concern of the ordinance, but not the moratorium.
yeah.
Right.
Well, except that the moratorium is to address the threat of
Yeah.
more
Right.
piers. So, in that way, it sort of does, it is affected by the moratorium, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think you're right, Bob. All right, we will add that one. Then we just talked about the potential piers in the outer harbor.
Mean coastal,
Nope.
okay.
Outer,
Yeah.
actual outer, and that for residential piers, and I do want to, I looked at this. What went to bed last night, and I realized the map, that Will created that I included in this shows 5 piers, but that's because one of those is actually at Lake Beach. Therefore, it would be a municipal pier.
Right.
So, I need to just make a note.
Right, there's possibility of 4.
For residential.
Right.
For residential, 1 by Dillingham Point, and then 3 on the other side.
Question.
Yep.
Maybe this is for Will, if we have the municipal Lake Beach Pier and that other potential Dillingham, are they still 300 feet apart?
Yep.
Okay,
By coastline, not by.
Yeah.
well, and
Municipal one.
at some point I'll stop by you my time and I'll,
To that one, I know you would. Fair enough.
Municipal Lake Beach Pier.
that they were just talking about a potential pier coming off of the Lake Beach area.
Would have been, now, so then we get into the coastal, we talked about, how many are there are none on the north side of the coastal harbor, and that's from Northeast Point north to the down line, there's none up there right now. And there's 3 on the south side, south of Curtis Island in the coastal harbor. This is one thing that Bob was talking about was that, I had uncovered this visual impact assessment
Right.
matrix, which was a very detailed spreadsheet. I couldn't put my fingers on it because I wanted to include it with this, so we do want to find that and include it. That is, excuse me, that is if you need to get a NERPA permit, if you need to get a Army Corps permit, then they go through that visual matrix process. That's my understanding of this process.
And generically, what kind of docks require that?
Well, there's the question. I thought all docks that would be out there do on all floats. However, and this is one of the things that I want to, that I think we can and should bring up in this. You may recall that we had a float that was approved last year in Sherman's Cove. Did not require, apparently.
It was attached to the land or out?
It was attached to the land,
Yeah.
but not to a pier.
Right.
And,
Considered temporary.
and it was considered, I don't want to go into, I don't know specifically why the select board determined that it did not need a permit, and therefore they couldn't, essentially, their hands were tied, is basically what it seemed to me.
Because ordinance right now only talks about piers. And that
Well, it does
can-
talk about floats.
It does talk about floats that are attached to piers,
Mhm.
Correct.
but it doesn't, I don't believe it says anything about floats that
That aren't
don't-
attached to
that are
piers.
not attached to piers.
Okay,
And I think there's a
that's what,
feeling of this committee that that's an oversight that probably should be corrected.
correct. I would agree with you there, Richard. Therefore, so I think that in our recommendations, we need to correct that oversight, I guess you could say. I think this is the opportunity, and it is directly, because the ordinance, the moratorium speaks specifically to piers, docks, floats, ramps, and other structures. It is
Oh,
not
yeah,
just
it's
piers.
something we should
Even though,
consider.
even though it's called a pier moratorium or something, it's, so therefore, I think it is important that, floats that are attached to the land, need to be also, need to undergo the same application process, the same level of scrutiny. as
No.
others.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure what the 2-prong thing was, and now I get it.
All right, so then, in all of these
Well-
3,
Can I ask a question? Just and maybe Will can help me answer this. I mean, if someone, remember, everyone with riparian rights has a right to have a mooring. Right? And I don't think there's any prohibition on that mooring being for a float.
nope, I think there is, respectfully, Jeremy. When I read through the ordinance, and I found that citation about nothing in this shall violate that state statute about the riparian rights. It said,
Chapter 38.
chapter 38, okay.
Yeah,
Go to Richard's.
that's,
And it says that they are allowed to have a mooring. It
Right.
Never, but and a mooring is defined in the ordinance as a thing for securing a vessel or something like that, but a float is specifically described as something different, which is for the transfer of passengers or goods or something like that. So I think that they are allowed, so I think that, again, this is not I shouldn't be the one voting on this, it should be Bill, but my reading of it was that they are allowed a mooring, but nothing more than a mooring. If they choose to put a float on. it becomes a different
Okay,
float.
we should get some clarification because I was coming from your perspective and then had a discussion with some legal counsel on this, and we should just get some clarification on that. I think that would be
Yeah.
helpful.
Absolutely, because that's clearly, that was my read of it.
Mhm.
Someone,
Okay.
a legal person should read it, absolutely. But I do think that this is because we're being asked to look at piers, docks, floats, ramps, and other structures, that we should address the float issue, the float not connected to a pier. So then I have this is like, super loose recommendation kind of idea about change the wording to require that if you don't need basically what I was trying to get to, and I want to ask the committee this. It seemed in our review that the NERPA permits, the Army Corps permits are so detailed and thorough that we determined that is sufficient. That is a sufficient level of oversight for piers, docks, ramps, floats, and other structures. But if there's a case where something in the harbor doesn't require a federal permit, it needs to get a level of scrutiny that it doesn't.
what determines that distinction? Well,
Yeah, a float.
No, not necessarily. So if you have just a seasonal gangway and float, that doesn't trigger NERPA because it can be, as long as it's in less than 7 months of the year, 7 months or less. But it still requires an Army Corps permit. And I've seen people make this mistake, including that one that you're mentioning. So
Huh,
anything that's in navigable waters needs a permit from the
so
Army,
it needs an Army Corps permit, but not a NERPA.
but not a NERPA permit.
Oh,
If it's a permanent structure, then it needs a NERPA permit. Any permanent structure, even if it's just on the shore, even if it doesn't go out beyond the water, it needs a NERPA permit.
okay. So that would be a distinction that we would want to clarify, is making sure that a seasonal structure, ramp, float. Yes, Bob.
I have and that's why I wanted to look at it again, but my memory of the visual matrix that in terms of my concerns, that was plenty of detail, but sort of also missing the target. My memory was that it had more to do with like right on the land and how it would look and fit in, and it really didn't have to do with the thing that was sticking out in the water and whether that would be a problem. So that's why I wanted to look at it again, because the way we're wording this, we're putting an awful lot of faith in it.
Yeah.
And then just the second thing, I go back that I don't think 300 feet following the meandering shoreline is effective. I think the point is, and I don't care what the number is, though I sort of like 300. It's the pier that goes out should not be facing 300 feet to any other pier.
Mhm.
And that, to me, helps deal with this density thing considerably, because I think 100 yards between piers is probably enough that I'm not so concerned with like visual access and stuff like that, but just two things. It doesn't make any sense to have two piers that can be different distances apart from each other, all depending on how the shoreline runs. Why are we letting one be closer than the other because the shore has a little bow to it?
Mhm.
I think in my opinion, that's kind of a moot point, because the three on the west side of the harbor are 300 feet apart because the shoreline is straight. The only one's concerned is the one in Dillingham Point, which just goes way in. the visual isn't affected too much in there. Plus, it's unlikely to that private one.
You're saying that the west side is more straight, the
Right,
west side is
it's
basically.
the shoreline's straight
It
there.
is-
So you're doing 300 feet. I'm just saying it may not be necessary to change it. I agree with your point, but it may not be necessary to change it because there's can only be 3 more built anyways, and they're all.
But
300 feet
that,
apart.
we're, to do an ordinance. No offense, to do an ordinance based entirely on the thought process of one person looking at aerial photos or whatever.
Mhm.
It's not the way to draft the ordinance. You know, if we should have a principle, and then 10, 20 years from now, when other people are playing games with things. And we discover, well, that's not what we thought was the situation, we should draft it for what's right. And chances are, it'll result in exactly the map that Will has shown, but the ordinance should be drafted based on what makes sense.
What's actually there. Fair enough. All right, so then let's move into habitat. I was surprised, and this is where I'm sorry that Rebecca can't be here. I was surprised that there is no mention of habitat, as far as I can find it, in the Harbor and Waterways ordinance. And once again, I got to the same level of thinking, okay, wait a minute. If there is a project that doesn't require a Army Corps permit, or, well, I was using NERPA permits now, and we'll think that through a little bit. How do we protect that? How do we make sure that that project, whether it's a seasonal float with a ramp or whatever, that it also gets a level of, the habitat gets a level of consideration when we or the town is approving it or reviewing, you see what I mean?
But I think it's gonna be hard with the, because I think what we're doing is we're dovetailing and using the resources of these other government entities that have scientists and internal regulations, et cetera. And if we want, it's not like you can just take a matrix and say, now do it yourself. You know, if you're gonna apply all of that, then you have to have people capable of doing it.
I guess, yeah, what I was thinking was just, I felt that if they are requiring, if a project gets, has to get state or federal approval, then, okay, now we know that habitat is going to be considered
Right.
and reviewed. But if there is a project that doesn't require state or federal approval, what can we put in? Maybe it's not the visual, the matrix, or we don't try to put it this way. I think what you're saying is we don't want the town to have to do a NERPA, like do a.
Well, I think we also need someone who knows what they're talking about to tell us whether, you know, we're talking about these things that quotes are temporary, but they come from the shore and they float on the water. And that's a different analysis than things that are covering the sea bottom. So do we actually know that the stuff that the state and feds are looking at ecology wise are really of great concern when what you're really talking about is a float that sits on top of the water for a while?
Really?
In Habitat, it states, all applications to construct a pier are subject to review by DEP and Army Corps.
All happens to
All
here.
applications to construct a pier. Now, is there an example of something that does not require those reviews?
Well, the float that we just talked about did.
Okay.
That's an example.
A ramp float without a pier.
Self-attached float.
Self-attached ramp and float. Yep, that's where I think we're, unfortunately,
And it turns out it needs the Army Corps, but not,
it does require an Army Corps permit.
so it means federal permit, but not.
But not a NEPA permit, which is a deeper permit.
Well, Josh, as far as what the Army Corps looks at, they don't like the floats to ground out.
Right.
But if they do, there's different things that they ask you to do to try to mitigate that, and some of it depends on what the type of the bottom is. The other thing they look hard at is eelgrass
Okay.
beds.
I knew we'd hear that today.
Yeah, and they have state maps. The maps are so-so as far as accuracy because it doesn't take much of a storm to move them around. And sometimes they come and go, but if your float is over an eelgrass bed, then you may not get the permit. If you get the permit, you may pay compensation for the square footage that they think you're impacting. And it's not just the float, depending on the depth, it could be prop wash.
It could be a what?
Prop wash. So if you're coming to a float that has eelgrass under it, and you've got,
Turn it up.
and you've got outboards,
Are you?
then you could potentially impact.
You feeling
So
okay?
just filling in on the type of stuff that, so when you go out to do one of these permits, you actually have a,
I came up to
on
you.
a boat, you've got this device, I can't remember what it's called, that you put down in the water so that you can see. I used to have the guys hang over the boat with a mask and snorkel, but they didn't like that much. But anyway, so we're actually out there mapping the eelgrass to try to figure out where it really is and hopefully avoid it if we can.
So on the federal permit for the float that doesn't have a pier, they actually are doing this review?
So that's not
So
even,
that's
not for
the-
NERPA, but for just.
That's
Army
the Army
Corps.
Corps. And the Army Corps is actually more, I was trying to pick a word that I should use. They're more picky. They're more, yeah, they're definitely, they pay a lot of attention to that.
Okay.
The eelgrass issue, more than their.
I've got a question. And I hate to muddy the water with this, but Will, and I guess Steve, I mean, Steve, you move moorings around all over the place, right?
I think I used to, now I'm giving the inspectors, the approved inspectors, the right to nudge a mooring and place a mooring.
Right. So I guess if someone came into the town and there was available for a new mooring, don't you just go place it
I
in the
do,
mooring field?
I do.
Okay, so I guess just getting to the question, and I mean, maybe we need some clarification from Army Corps. I mean, are we doing something wrong if our harbor master is?
No, you're not doing anything wrong. The way the rules are written, the harbor masters and the harbors and moorings don't fall under those same scrutiny as private piers and moorings, even though those moorings in the harbor are all privately used.
Okay,
Yeah.
There's nothing that requires that.
As long as the work is done after dark.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily, but that's the way it is.
So.
Okay.
Can I have some clarification here?
Yes.
So the Army Corps and the NERPA rules do not apply to the moorings?
Right.
They just
Right.
apply to piers, floats, docks.
Right.
Oh my God.
They've subjugated that to the towns and the harbor masters. And part of the reason is it just wouldn't work. Right, if you had to go through that scrutiny every time you touched a mooring out there, it would make it impossible, cost prohibitive. And the Corps and the DEP don't have the staff to do it anyway.
No.
Right, if Steve was calling them every time something changed in the harbor, it wouldn't work.
Okay.
It's just not practical.
Moorings tend to be in deeper water where, at least
Right.
relative to
I was gonna say that,
eelgrass doesn't exist.
Right, most of the time, you're right.
That
I would
would
say
be
98% of the
a
time.
very rare situation.
Yep, it does need to be relatively shallow. Which is where the ordinance portions appears to be, so it kind of makes sense that they do look at that.
Mhm.
All right, let's move into the, I'm gonna take the last two pieces together, because I think that they kind of have almost all the same recommendations, but it is public access, and we had that lengthy presentation with Bill Kelly, discussion with Bill Kelly about what the public's right to public access is in the intertidal zone. It's not quite what some, like a lot of folks think, actually. But there is a right for fishing, fouling, and navigation. And as we said, the effect of additional piers on public access is actually minimal on new piers. But if the piers stay at right now, the piers can only be 6 feet off of high water. And the problem is, as sea level rise, it comes up, the gap is getting smaller and smaller. So you can squeeze under these less and less, and therefore you are restricting public access in that spot. So the question, this is why I wanted to do that in the sea level rise, is this idea of raising the pier restriction. So we have a pier height restriction in the outer harbor of 6 feet, and we have a pier height limit in the coastal harbor of 10 feet.
So I had a question at the end about the recommendation, because these have been talked about as limits, but actually we're talking about it in terms of climate change. So the real question is, should there be a minimum above presently existing and a maximum as well?
Oh, minimum and maximum.
So that because we're trying to prevent docks from becoming dysfunctional. So the way we've worded it is raising the limit. If we're talking about making them potentially adjustable, et cetera, should we be simply saying that in light of everything, whenever it's built, it should be at least this much above the then existing high tide and not more than some other number?
It could get precarious if it's too tall.
Well, I think we're really talking about the upper limit would be, but then I think it's a good point that maybe we should be talking about a minimum limit as well. Like, you can't make the pier that is 4 feet above,
Right.
you know what I mean?
You know,
Because we know it's gonna be underwater, so we're just not gonna let you build. it.
Well, except for they're all being made so they can be raised.
Right, if we, yeah.
Well, that's a recommendation.
Right.
And
Yeah, right. That's-
for this morning, I'm not trying to articulate anything other
Yeah.
than, I mean, the question was, should we have
A
a
minimum.
minimum as well as a maximum?
Mhm.
In light of the fact that we're trying to make them more long-term durable.
And maybe storm surge would be more important here.
Yeah,
There's also the question of when we talk about above high water, we've been using, the ordinance is using the term mean high water.
Right.
Which one is a moving target. 6 feet above mean high water. 10 or 20 years from now, maybe only 4 feet above
Right.
mean high water.
yeah.
And I think, Will, there's some other definitions of high water that are more useful.
Is well, what NERPA goes by for setback purposes, and actually the town does too, is highest annual tide. So, and they're both published by NOAA every updated yearly. And most of the time what the ordinance says is in the year that the structure was constructed, right? Because it's changing. Your
bench,
starting point
yeah,
is whatever it was
at that.
at the time that you built it.
So I think you were out of this one. I raised the question whether if we're worried about sea level rise and durable docks. Right now, we just talked about that it can't be higher than whatever. Should we be establishing some? It has to be at least X feet higher than the high tide in the year it's being built. Or do we not even need to say it because there's an industry standard and nobody would ever vary from it? What's your thought?
Yeah, I'd be surprised. I mean, anybody building these things doesn't want the structure getting
Outdated.
inundated with water or hit by water or wave action. Just because it won't hold up, which is one of the issues I have in Camden. Camden is one of the very few towns that we work in. In fact, I can't even think of another one that has a height limitation.
Huh.
There's no height limitation with the Army Corps or DEP. And
And I think this was,
I think this was totally an aesthetic.
it was, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm almost certain.
But I do,
From a practical standpoint.
from a practical standpoint, I think going from the highest annual tide would make more sense.
Yeah,
Just because there's a 2-foot difference sometimes between the two.
is it really that much?
Yeah, I can believe it.
Yeah,
This year especially.
What would,
Well, I've also seen or heard the term highest astronomical tide, which both abbreviate to the same thing.
I think they're synonyms.
Okay.
what, my question was, okay. I picked 8 feet literally out of thin air about what it should be, you know what I mean? Because I was like, well, it's 6 in the outer harbor and it's 10 in the coastal harbor. Maybe the outer harbor should be 8. I feel like that's not the best way to come up with a number. Is there a better way to do that? Where we can say it's, you know, not less than X number of feet above highest annual tide, you know what I mean? Because that's sort of the same thing.
So you're switching it
Well,
when you say less than.
right, when we were talking about, and we keep talking about the limit. And it's like, well, our real problem is we keep wanting to have docks that are gonna be long-term viable. Should we also have a minimum? Or that's why I was asking you, is it, yeah, you should have a minimum, but there's an industry standard that you would never think about going under.
Yeah, the only reason I hesitate on the minimum is that some of these piers are built with steel beams that are maybe 12 to 14 inches deep. And then some of them are built with blue laminated beams that are 30 inches deep. And so there's a big difference there. And
When you say deep, what do you mean?
the depth of the actual structure,
Thickness of it.
the thickness of it. So from
Oh, this way.
right horizontally. And so I'm thinking about wanting to protect the structure from getting hit with water or debris and waves. So the underside isn't necessarily relative all the time to the top.
And so the other side is what we care about for durability.
And for getting under it.
Mhm.
For the guy in the
Yeah,
back.
this is where we get into the public access.
And so it can get complicated, right? The more piles you have, the less depth you need your beams to be. But if you want to span 50 feet and not have many piles or supports, then that's when you end up with
These
these steel
huge
beams
beams.
or blue laminated beams.
Mhm.
The blue laminated beams, if they're spanning 50, 60 feet are 3 feet deep.
Well, I think that would be if we went with a minimum, then you have to, that's just a definitional thing where you have to put it. The lowest part of the superstructure, or whatever the right word is, needs to be X feet from the astronomical high tide.
Right. Maybe, I guess the question would be, what's the goal?
Yeah.
Of the committee in setting those heights?
I think
Right, so
It's a-
if there's a maximum height, then it's probably aesthetics. If there's a minimum height, it's probably twofold.
I think both,
It's one, allowing people to go under them
Mhm.
and protecting that structure,
right, I think it's both, I think,
right?
because there is a certain amount of public access that we want to preserve.
So I think there's,
Underneath
the
it.
difficult thing is there's so many variables involved with how they get built and what it is. I'm not sure the best way to write it, that's
I
all.
know.
I understand what you're saying, I don't disagree with any of those.
Well, let me just take the 40,000 feet, are we all in agreement that this is something that we want to change?
Mm.
That we all,
Yeah, I think
just
so,
a
yeah.
gut check,
Yes.
that we want to change the heights, whether it's the minimum and the maximum in the outer harbor.
Maybe instead of heights, just change it to highest annual tide.
Well, I don't think that solves the problem.
No, you still, that's a benchmark.
We're talking about the minimum. You know,
Yeah,
the
well, yeah,
clearance,
okay, yeah.
So the kayaker can get under it without bending over too far. Um,
Okay,
And I know establishing a minimum, on the one hand, maybe I'm being too lawyerly, but considering all the things that will never happen. But the fact is, there are a lot of abandoned docks out there. And they don't look too good.
Mhm.
So if a dock gets damaged enough, we can't necessarily assume that the person's gonna come along and
maintain it and.
rebuild it at a higher level and it'll all look fine and all come out in the wash. So there is some public interest in making sure that once you build it, there's a good chance of surviving.
Right, and this is where I think we would be looking at adjusting the standards, the building standards that are all in the criteria and all of that. So I think one of the things that I'm starting to realize is this may be a little more loosey-goosey than we want, but it may be what we need to do it to say, we know that we want to raise these piers. We're gonna have to figure out how much, you know what I mean? Like, I don't feel like I'm totally qualified to make those decisions. Hey, Ethan. Hello. I thought were you yelling to us or no? Oh, probably was.
That's-
He's getting
I
hooked
thought,
up.
I thought Ethan was raising his hand.
I had a phone call interrupt me, so I'm trying to get my Bluetooth back working. That's all.
Oh, okay, no worries. I thought you were raising. your
Well,
hand.
Ethan, I don't know if you were listening, we were talking about not only the question of should the maximum height of a dock be changed, but also should there be a minimum height that the superstructure is above whatever becomes the new high tide.
Could we just suggest a minimum height so that the pier will be protected and navigation can happen at high tide?
Something like that.
Don't give them the
Don't give them.
number, but just say,
We at least we'll have the intent in there, if not the number. That's what I'm thinking. The time is a little bit wasting, so I do want to just go to the last. I think we're all of the same mind about what we want to do with the pier height, minimum and maximum and possible minimum. But I also wanted to ask about this idea of that the require that piers have the ability to be raised. Are we all on the same page with that?
I am.
Everybody else?
And again, I think that we need to articulate the issue and the aspiration, but the performance standards
Right.
might be determined by other people with more expertise.
I totally agree.
Exactly what does it mean that it can be raised? How much flexibility needs to be engineered in up front? But the bottom line
The
is,
guy sitting behind you is the one that
Well,
does
there's enough
that.
money we can raise anyway,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
but then with enough money, you don't even think about it. They'll let them wash it out and the money will let you rebuild
there you
it.
go. I mean, again, it depends on how it's built.
Right.
Right, if it's a pile supported pier, then it's harder to raise it. What we've done on those, when we have raised them, is you just add a couple more cap beams, but there's a limit to how many of those you can raise. If it's granite, it's easier. They lift it, put it
more
back in
granite
granite,
and good to
and
go.
off you go. I mean, I say it's easier. It still means a barge comes in, lifts it up and, so I think it's good to put it in there,
Mhm.
but I'm not sure it changes anything.
Well, but right now it's not a requirement, and I think it would be, I think it would become a requirement where we actually said.
But what is that mean?
I mean, in the performance standard, you'd have to, when they go through, and say, we want to create a new pier, here's the plan and all that. We would then say, okay, show us how, if sea level rises by 4 feet or whatever the number is, it can be raised.
Right.
You have to
How
demonstrate.
deep are your pockets?
Yeah, pretty much.
No, but I think the performance standard could be that it has to be engineered in a manner that it could be raised 2 feet, 4 feet, whatever, without major reconstruction, whatever.
So I think that it's an engineering problem. If someone applies for construction of a new pier, dock, whatever you want to call it, then I would think a progressive engineering firm would also give the new owner that wants this built the recommendations of the town that they have the ability to adjust the height
Mhm.
of these piers. I don't think it's unreasonable
Right.
to expect that of a.
And you would do it at I think the thing is you do it at the outset. You do it when you do the
Exactly.
initial plans. Say,
Exactly.
this is the one we're building and the posts are this high. And just so you know, if in 30 years, 50 years, we have to raise it, this is how we would do it.
And I don't think that it's our concern to tell these individuals, well, it's gonna cost you a lot of money.
no,
I don't care.
That's not.
You want this, how much are you willing to pay for it?
Right.
That's the bottom line.
or it'll be raised, RAZED.
Well, I guess my question on that would be something like, okay, if the plan is that it has to be raised and it's on piles, then we'll drive new piles. Is that acceptable?
Well,
Can
that's
you say that
interesting. You'd have to drive new pylons,
Oh,
Well, because right now you can limit the height of piles above the pier.
right?
unless it's.
But I think that you said at an earlier meeting that on the piles, that there was a certain amount of, the ability to add
Yeah.
without redoing.
Yeah, you
And
see,
I forget whether it's just we're adding cross tiers above the pylon.
yeah, I mean, like right now in Booth Bay Harbor, we're redoing the
Maybe
footbridge
that's what
that crosses Booth Bay Harbor. And because of cost, they didn't want to tear it all out and redo all the piles. That was the biggest expense. So we're leaving the piles and adding additional cap beams. So you add another 12 by 12 over the top of the piles, that lifts the whole thing 12
And
inches.
it's,
But you still have to take off the entire deck structure, railing and everything else. And rebuild the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I just want to make everybody,
well, is that in Booth Bay, does it literally mean you have to take that off and throw it away, or it's just like with the granite where you gotta lift it up, get it up like a house, put new footings under it, you put the support under, you drop it back down?
in that case, what's there isn't
It's
good enough to do that to. But if it was relatively new, you could potentially lift. put
And since
another
we're talking
deck
about
on, set it
new-
back down.
New, we're
I
talking
guess-
about new.
But who gets to make the decision of whether or not that plan is acceptable? I guess that's what's interesting to
Well,
me,
mhm.
is I can come up with all kinds of ways to say, yeah, we can lift this thing. And, but who gets to decide if that's acceptable and based on what?
But this all goes back to that maximum height above high tide, because you can tell your customer, well, let's build it up 2 feet higher to begin with, and then we will avoid that altogether, but that might butt up against the 6 feet above mean high tide.
But remember, every time you go up, it makes the gangway steeper.
Yeah,
We talked about that.
Yeah, that's true.
And so
Yeah.
there's just a lot of,
A lot of moving parts.
moving
parts.
That's what I was saying at the beginning, yeah.
Does replacing or adding files trigger a new application and review process?
typically, if the piles, you're not adding piles, you're just replacing them, then there is a permit process, but it's really simplified. It's not through the town. It's through the state. It can be done under permit by rule, all you're doing is putting it back in.
Well, it may be that some of this problem could be answered by putting in the minimum height requirement
Mhm.
that you already factor in. If we start X feet above whatever high tide is at that moment, we are less worried about 30 years from now having to get Will involved or Will's son involved in all of this stuff. When this conversation first started, we weren't thinking about having a minimum height. We were just thinking about, well, what if it turns out to be too low? Do we build in flexibility? But if you put a minimum height in, maybe you've kind of taken care of the question.
Mhm.
Junction, sorry, I've got to head out in a few minutes, I've got a minute 10. Just listening to this, though, a couple things that I think that might be helpful to the committee at the next meeting, because I'm assuming you're going to continue to work on the draft some more. Might be to bring a couple typical sections of some of the piers in Camden Harbor. One that's steel and one that's laminated timber,
Mhm.
and you can see what the difference is between mean high water and the underside of the pier. I mean, I paid attention this summer knowing this was happening and took some pictures too of people kayaking under these things. So I could get a sense of how much should you lift it. So I could bring in some of those typical sections.
That'd be
It might be helpful to see.
Yeah.
You know, and the other one was the measuring along the shore. And I could do the same thing with the ones that we've actually, my office has done and show what the distance would be straight line, just so you get it.
Superstructure.
Yeah.
Well, you still gotta define how you're gonna do it and where your starting point is. So I'm assuming you'd still say from mean high water.
I would have, if I was just drawing it up, I'd simply say, no part of the pier can be closer
No part
to
of any of
300
the
feet.
structure.
300 feet to
perpendicular
another
distance.
thing, yeah.
Yeah, so I think seeing what that actually looks like would be, like,
Yeah, if you're willing to do that.
because the only other thing I think that we should think about when they change that definition is that, does that now make some existing piers non-conforming? Because they may not be the 300 feet anymore, and that's always a little bit disconcerting for the person who met the rules when they did it, and now they're told that they're
Well,
non-conforming structure.
you'd always be grandfathered.
Right.
Right.
But you could
But
also,
it's-
I mean, you could also, if you went with a straight line thing, if the 300 may change. if you, it's 300 feet measured along the shoreline, but it might be 200 if it's measured straight line or something, you know what I mean? Like, it's not, they don't all have to. If you change one system, we could change the other.
When you need,
Well, that's gonna be our next thing. is what we need.
well, you can let me
Yeah.
know, and I can just get this information to you, and
Yep.
I'll try to be
That'd be
here.
very
when I can.
We're talking about December 25th.
Yeah.
Right.
What around noon?
The 24th at 6 p.m.
All right, well, thank you, Will. So I do want to, I think this has been a lively and, as always, good discussion on this topic. I do want to continue to take the agenda out of order, and because I know you have to leave in a minute. Bruce. Yep.
1 minute.
So let's talk about the next meeting. Unfortunately, December is going to get very ugly for me pretty quickly. So I was going to see what we all could do. Would it be possible for our next meeting, which might be the December meeting, to meet on November 30th, Wednesday, November 30th? So that's 2 weeks from this Wednesday. It's the Wednesday after Thanksgiving.
Mhm.
I'm gone. I bet I have to bring a boat down, and I think it'll probably be the first half of December is what it's gonna end up taking. So, and then we're gonna get into Christmas. So the 30th, does that work for people? Good for you, Elliot, Margie?
I've got another 10:45.
Okay.
Higher
you
than-
don't believe
higher
that?
than-
Yep, that's fine. All right, let's do that. Let's do the 30th at 8 o'clock in the morning.
If Josh doesn't change it on the fly.
Exactly.
I'll get you soon.
I couldn't avoid that, Josh.
All right, thanks, Will.
All right, happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
See you later.
Okay.
So, here we are.
Here we are, yeah, so the last item on the agenda, well, actually, we have two items, one for you, Steve, which is not on the agenda, I guess is a non-agenda item, is there has been a request to put you on as a agenda item for just a harbor master report in the future. So totally taking things out of, do you have anything to report from the harbor today that you want us to know about?
The only interesting thing is that, all the single lane floats are out of the water, and, I was a little nervous because, they are showing their age. And, not knowing the exact way they were built, because you can't really see inside them, you can look at them and say, oh, it looks like Prop did this to make them strong. Over the years, the past 7 years, I've been taking ones that were actually, you could see them moving independently of the 2x6s that you walk on. And it's because the through bolts, the threaded rod through bolts have been egging out, because all day long, you're just moving around, so they're egged out enough so the whole structure is like moving a little bit.
So is it the bolts that are backed, the nuts that are backed off, or just the wood is getting worn?
The holes are getting oblong.
Holes are getting oblong,
Okay.
and there's a few spots where the threaded rod has actually, broken and not there. So I'm working with Public Works, and we are taking 3 of them apart partially and putting new threaded rod in to make it so we can, tighten them up. And it's working great what we've done. Just to make it so we can, the infrastructure can last, because that's a heck of a chunk of change. And I haven't even got a quote yet what that would be to replace them. So I think, we're gonna be able to make it so they can like another shabby looking, but as long as they're not unsafe, they're gonna fall apart. That's what I'm worried about. So, but yeah, we're working on that, and the welcome, we had an issue with that. Remember, that's a 1978 engine in a 1990 aluminum boat that we had to design for a time when the harbor master had a town derrick, and would move a lot of moorings. By now, we're Ford approved inspectors, they do that. So I talked with Audra about possibly selling that aluminum boat if that engine, instead of repowering it for $50,000 to $60,000, just sell it. I only used it to put the navigation aids in and out,
Mhm.
really. So that's about it.
Cool, thank you. Okay, given the time, where we are, I'm gonna, and since we just set the November meeting, we're gonna hold off on the harbor fees. Until the next meeting. We do have to do that at the next meeting. Because the select board has to, do those in December. So we'll tackle those next time around.
The various harbor fees.
Anything else? Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
So I got the more of the story that.
You think so?